Julia.
And then begin, okay. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends of the International Crisis Group, good afternoon or morning or midday or whatever is appropriate to your time zone. And thank you for having joined us today for this roundtable on security in the Western Balkans, Bosnia's dual challenge. My name is Olga Oliker. I am Crisis Group's Program Director for Europe and Central Asia, and I am really thrilled to welcome you on behalf of my colleagues and all of us from the Conflict Prevention and Peacebuilding community. For those of you who don't know us, Crisis Group is an independent organization that works to prevent wars and shape policies that can build sustained peace. Our mandate is to engage with all parties and support efforts to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent and deadly conflict. And we do so by sounding the alarm bell, by providing independent, field-based, and high-quality analysis, and by engaging directly with conflict actors and key international players like yourselves to encourage informed and intelligent action that forwards the cause of peace. And indeed, this event is an opportunity to do so with you and all colleagues and friends who are connected and following us. For our virtual roundtable today, just so you know, we've got about 100 folks who registered on Zoom, a very rich and diverse audience, policymakers, experts, diplomats working on peace and security from the European Union and its member states, colleagues from civil society and international organizations, folks from the region. This event is on the record and it's being live streamed on our YouTube channel where a larger audience can attend and also listen later. This event is part of an ongoing collaboration between Crisis Group and the European Commission under the Instrument Contributing to Stability and Peace, and in partnership with the European External Action Service. We would like to thank the European Union very much for their support. So the way this is going to work is I am going to chat with our panelists for about 40-ish minutes. And then we will open the floor to Q&A with the audience, which we're going to ask you to do by posing questions in the chat and in the Q&A. But I want that to be a very robust part of this discussion because it's a great group of you out there and we really do want to hear what you have to say. A note before we begin. You may have noticed that what we have here today is a manel. We do not have any panelists today who are not men. That is not how we like to do things. It's not how I personally like to do things. Crisis Group and I firmly believe that the participation of women and of other people who are not men is crucial to conflict resolution, to conversations about conflict resolution, and that a peace that allows for the exclusion of voices on the basis of gender or other attributes for that matter is not a true, a lasting, or an inclusive peace. We are committed to inclusiveness across all of our activities. And I want to talk a little bit about how we do this. We do it by streamlining gender-sensitive conflict analysis across all of our work, by making every effort to shed light on poorly understood gender dynamics in conflict settings, including the shaping of norms and politicization of societal expectations and how they differ by gender. With the financing that supports this roundtable specifically, Crisis Group seeks out the viewpoints of women from a variety of socioeconomic, religious, ethnic, and other backgrounds as we do our research. We monitor that our publications are gender sensitive and address differentiated impact of violent conflict on people of different genders. We include women who are active in local civil society and in activities that will integrate civil society organizations and experts to ensure that they are there to discuss key conflict issues and potential responses. We specifically target women as part of our advocacy activities, and we strive to ensure adequate representation and participation of people of all genders at our events. And yet today we have a panel before you composed of men. I'm not going to make excuses for it. I am going to say that one thing I've noticed in recent months, as travel has recommenced, as the end of the year approaches, as people are being asked to appear more and more both in person and virtually, that women have seemed to me more likely than men to pull out of events. I don't know if that's just my perception, if it reflects a deeper reality. I have a suspicion that people face different challenges professionally due to their gender, and particularly at this time of year, your likelihood of being stretched thin may be higher if you happen to be female. But the other thing this says to me is that our methodology for ensuring adequate gender representation is not sufficient, and that we at Crisis Group need to do better. And I can tell you that we carefully assessed whether we wanted to continue with this roundtable despite the situation, and given Bosnia's fragility and the urgency of what's going on the ground, we decided to hold the conversation. But we do that with the recognition that we have failed on this important count. So I want to apologize on behalf of Crisis Group. I want to reassure you that we will continue all our efforts to ensure adequate representation of women's expertise and viewpoints, and indeed of expertise and viewpoints that represent a variety of usually underrepresented groups. We will redouble our efforts to ensure the adequate participation of people of a variety of genders in our work and what we do. I personally would like to take this opportunity to pledge not to take part again in an academic or policy discussion event that has more than 2 speakers if all of those speakers are men. So I'm sorry, we're sorry. Having said that, I would like to introduce our speakers for today, who are very capable, competent people, and who I think we will have a really interesting discussion with. So we have Kurt Bessiner, co-founder and senior associate of the Democratization Policy Council, a Berlin-based think tank established in 2005, long-term Balkans watcher. We have Srećko Latal, who is a researcher on the Western Balkans at the Crossroads Project. He is with the Prague Security Studies Institute, and he's an editor of Balkan Insight, another long-term watcher of the Western Balkans since the 1990s. And finally, Marko Prelic, who is our consulting senior analyst on the Balkans here at Crisis Group. All 3 of these men have been watching the region for a very, very long time and know a lot about it. So to start off the conversation, I am going to turn first to Marko to ask him whether Bosnia and Herzegovina is about to fall apart. Will Republika Srpska secede? What's going on, Marko?
Hi, Olya. I guess the answer to your question in my mind is that Bosnia and Herzegovina is falling apart already, but in extreme slow motion. So, and arguably it has been falling apart for some time, and the slow-mo has been getting a little bit less slow. Maybe to explain that in just a few more words, what has happened recently is the Serb entity, the Republika Srpska, the smaller of the country's 2 entities, which date back to the Dayton Peace Agreement, and in fact to the war before that, which has talked a lot and frequently about wanting to break away, has now started to take moves in that direction by passing laws that are incompatible, or by saying it is going to pass laws that are incompatible with the ongoing sovereignty of the state. But its schedule for doing that is running into next year. So the laws are supposed to pass next summer, and then after that they would take effect. And so we would be looking at potentially a really acute crisis sometime next year, which is also probably not coincidentally an election year. Elections are due in October, so I think we're potentially looking at a big crunch sometime mid to late 2022.
Thanks, Marko. So I want to turn to Kurt to ask what's behind this harder line from the Serbian community, and is there space for compromise before things get worse?
What's behind this move by Dodik, but also the slow motion trajectory that Marko talked about, which I agree with, is the idea that European Union enlargement was going to solve this, and we didn't need the executive peace enforcement tools in the Dayton Agreement. And so we've been on this trajectory for coming up on 16 years now, and it's been documented in slow motion. So Dodik is each time He has pushed the red line further out. He has been appeased. He's been given something, and that's what has been talked about. I'm sure we'll talk about it further in the package of reforms and changes that the international community has been pushing the most expansively by Commissioner Varhev, both the election law and constitutional reform, but also state property, to kick that down to the lower levels to basically partition the country property-wise, and rescind the genocide denial change to the constitutional code. So Dodik, I think he wants what he says he wants, but he also expected more resistance than he got. And instead, we are allowing our policy to be defined by him and his colleague and partner, Dragan Čović, head of the HDZ-BiH, the Bosnian Croat Nationalist Party, which has been pushing for those election law changes, basically to ensure that he is going to be the president. So that is the matrix that led us to where we are now.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. And I want to come back to a lot of this, but first I want to ask Srećko about the election reform dispute between the Bosniaks and the Croats, which is kind of the, and Kurt already alluded to it, but it's the other side of this crisis. Can you talk a little bit to what's going on and how can that be repaired?
Well, thank you. Very good question. The problem is that at the moment it's very difficult to say whether or how this will be repaired, because in fact yesterday American and European Union negotiators have announced that they are effectively suspending the negotiations until further notice, saying that conditions are not good for continuation of this process. The underlying factor is the dispute between Bosniak parties and Bosnian-Croat parties, or main party HDZ, over the election in the presidency. I mean, that's the main dispute, because what has happened over the last several election cycles was that Bosnian-Croat candidate was Željko Komšić was elected predominantly with Bosniak votes, and there is an ongoing discussion, quite heated debate within the country and also between different international experts and officials, whether legitimate representation is something that the world and the country wants to pursue, or whether there is maybe a possibility for a more civic oriented or civic solution, which would respect the rulings of the several rulings. There were 5 the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights, which essentially found that the constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina is violating rights of certain ethnic groups and minorities in different parts of the countries, be it passive or active voting rights. The problem with the electoral reform, or additional problem with the electoral reform, is that it has been used as a platform by Milorad Dodik and Dragan Čović to establish and then gradually strengthen their cooperation, and using essentially the fact that Bosniaks are now electing 2 members of the presidency rather than 1, to underline the demographic problem with Bosnia and Herzegovina. And demographic problem is that since the Dayton Peace Accord, demographic changes in the country have made the country predominantly Bosniak. So Bosniaks are already making slightly over 50% of the population. Bosnian Serbs are making some 35%, and Bosnian Croats around 10% or less. So on one hand, we have the Dayton Peace Accord, which has effectively established some kind of ethnic balance or ethnic key for the ethnic representation in key institutions. On the other hand, we have demographic changes which have made it more and more difficult for this situation to be respected. And the last thing that I would like to also mention is another problem, problem that many local and international experts and officials see, mainly in the behavior of Bosniak parties, is that in response to the separatist agendas of Milorad Dodik and renewed autonomous push by HDZ. Many or most Bosniak parties have responded with essentially what is perceived as nationalist or centralist drives, which have added to the complexity of the situation in the country.
So, Karl von Clausewitz wrote that war is an extension of politics by other means. One of my permanent questions when looking at any crisis is this politics or is this war? How worried should any of us be that this means a return to violence? I'll start with Kurt and then ask others to jump in if they wish.
We're in a deterrence failure now. We've been in a deterrence failure for over a decade, since U4, the Chapter 7 mandated deterrent force that's mandated also by Annex 1A of the Dayton Peace Agreement, handed off by NATO at the end of 2004. It's been below strength for that long. It's now 660 troops. The potential for violence is real. And the High Rep has been very clear about this. I think that was quoted in your setup piece for this event. There is nothing standing in the way of it, and we are very prone to miscalculation because of how tense it's become. The potential good news is that this could be diffused quite quickly, not solved, but diffused in the sense that if you take away the secession narrative, Dodik, by making it impossible, by putting troops in Brčko, which my organization has advocated for well over a decade, that makes that impossible. That's all he has. Dodik only has his secession narrative. Now, you still have to arrive at a constitutional system that has validity among the citizens of the country. But what's perverse about this crisis is that at a time that political elites of every flavor and stripe are really despised by their people, the international community, led by the EU, but now very energetically pushed with the United States involvement as well, was coming to try to give them an incumbent protection program in the name of trying to pacify this. So we've allowed our agenda to be dominated by the troublemakers, and because we don't want to use those hard power tools to reassure citizens that violence won't be possible, instead we've shifted into an appeasement gear. So violence is a real threat.
Marco, do you agree? And is the binary that it's either you try to do diplomacy, but that turns into appeasement, or you've got to be willing to go to hard power? Is that also how you see it?
I'm going to disagree with my friend Kurt here and say, well, not totally disagree, I guess. I think there is some potential for violence, but we're about as far from the situation on the eve of the last war as it is possible to be, in a whole lot of different ways. So I think it's understandable the people who have lived through that and stayed in the country, and people whose careers were marked by it, as many of ours were, would be ultra sensitive to the prospect of war in Bosnia. But what we're really not looking at is any significant possibility of a replay of 92 to 95. So many fewer people, many fewer weapons, many fewer young people who would typically be the ones who would be conscripted into fighting. No real sign of any popular surge, which I guess you don't really need, but still, tiny percentages that are willing to fight on any side. No real signs of preparing for war, and some extraordinary statements coming out of RS, including the Milorad Dodik, the RS member of the presidency, Serb member of the presidency, saying, not only would we not attack, if attacked, we would not fight, which, you can take however you like, but is clearly sending a kind of signal there. And I guess the question I would have for my friend Kurt is, what would putting troops in Brčko do? I mean, they would presumably be there just under the same peacekeeping mandate that S4 and then U4 had. They're not there to enforce Bosnian law. They're just there to preserve a safe and secure environment. I'm not real clear on what the point of that would be.
Srečka, what do you think? Do you see violence as likely, and do you see more presence as part of the solution?
Well, in short, I would say that violence is possible, still hopefully not likely and not in the immediate future. So in a way, I see also good news and bad news. Good news being, as Marko said, that the context and the military capabilities in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in the wider region have changed. So there is no military dominance of JNA, which has triggered a series of wars in the Balkans in the 90s. There is also the fact that most of the people in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as Kurt said, are dissatisfied primarily with their own ethnic leaders, and most of them, a vast majority of them, would not really want to fight a new war. But there are also the bad news, and the bad news is that it has been clear, at least to me, ever since late 90s, that the war, or let me put it this way, that the peace in Bosnia depends directly on the territorial integrity of the country. And the moment that the territorial integrity of the country becomes jeopardized, that's the moment when Bosnia and Herzegovina will start slipping towards another conflict. That conflict would certainly not be, if it happens, and of course I hope it won't, it would not be anything like the one or those that we have seen in the 90s. But on the other hand, I would like to stress that in a way the situation is even more complicated or even worse than the situation in the 90s, especially from the perspective of regional and geopolitical context. Because as you know, in the 90s, the situation in Europe and the situation in the Balkans was dominated exclusively by the USA and the EU. And the breakup of former Yugoslavia was essentially the failure of the US and EU to prevent that failure, that breakup, and the subsequent wars. Now the situation is drastically different. I mean, we are having Serbia and Croatia, which are increasingly involved in internal issues of the neighboring countries. So we have, again, negative regional aspects. We have much stronger role and influence of Russia, of Turkey, of Gulf countries, China, in the internal politics of each and every Balkan country. In fact, I would dare to say that influence of Russia and China and Turkey together is certainly stronger than the influence of the European Union in the Balkans. US is still respected for its political and military power, but the US has not been exercising that power for more than a decade. And again, we are seeing these negative consequences of these divergent influences, which are part of the crisis.
Marko, you want to jump in on this?
Sorry, just trying to unmute myself. Yeah, one thing that's worth keeping in mind is that when the last war started, people were afraid that it would be like the war before that, like World War II. Okay, World War II took about 1 million lives in the territory of former Yugoslavia. The war in Bosnia was as horrible as we all remember it being, but killed about 100,000 people, so about 1/10. The fact that it's not necessarily going to be as bad as the last time doesn't mean that it's not bad. And it may be possible, and this is now getting really sort of into speculation, because we don't really have information that would allow us to do more than that at this stage. it may be possible that leaders will decide to use violence and the trauma that it inflicts on society to get themselves across the finish line, so to speak. So if you want to break up the country, it's very hard to get agreement, to get buy-in to that. But once there's a war, it becomes somewhat easier. Or if you want to, fundamentally reconfigure the country, it's also quite difficult to do that. But once there's fighting, once there's, people taking up arms, you might think that you can do things that were not otherwise possible. And I think there's some signs that the leaders of the warring factions in the early 90s were thinking along those lines. In some cases, they were fighting not so much to win an explicit goal, but to create the conditions under which certain political solutions would become thinkable. And we might emphasize the might, see something like that again.
Kurt, you want to jump in on this increasingly depressing point?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, it doesn't need to be the scale of, I mean, I agree with both Marko and Srećko that the correlation of forces, to use that old Soviet term, is different than it was in 1992. Everybody's about equally armed in terms of, man for man, and the advantages that the army of Republika Srpska had in that war of, first mover advantage and heavy weapons advantage. They don't have. But all it takes is a few people being killed to change the dynamic completely, as Marko just alluded to. And it's all preventable. I want to answer to Marko's point about Brčko. You take the secession narrative away if you have an interposing force in the connective tissue that's the RS, which Dodik has made very clear. He does, even in the maps that he tries to pose international officials with, that doesn't have Brčko district separate. So making it clear that we're not going to allow violence and we're not going to allow secession is different than saying we're not going to recognize it, we're not going to talk about it. All parties are equally unhelpful and not arriving at solutions. But on top of that, restoring deterrence gives you another benefit, is it takes the temperature down radically. People are afraid now in a way that they were not when I arrived in 2005 to work for Patty Ashdown. People were not afraid of renewed conflict. It wasn't even thinkable because the presumption was if anybody tried that, you'd kill them. And now nobody is afraid of that. So whatever your worst fear is, and there are many to choose from, they all seem plausible in a way that they did not. And that's on us. That is a Western failure. And there was a questioner, I'll just answer very quickly because it's easy to wrap into this. Yeah, the Brits were taken offline as the reserve force for EUFOR, but that's not an excuse for having a EUFOR deployed force that is roughly 1/8 of the brigade strength force that DSACUR has said is necessary to have a credible deterrent. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. So Srećko, I want to come back to you, but I also want to focus a little bit. What else is in the capacity of outside actors to do other than throw forces at it? Do they have other points of leverage that could be of some value?
I was just about to chip in and to react on what Kurt said and his proposal for reinforcement of EUFOR. It is certainly one option that has been discussed and proposed. It's not a new one. It has been discussed for many years. But what I would like to stress is, again, having in mind this significantly changed regional and geopolitical context, I'm afraid that we are out of safe and easy solutions. So compared to 5, 10, or 15 years ago, I think that now any option carries a certain greater or smaller risk with it. So I'm not saying that I'm personally against the idea of reinforcing EUFOR and deploying additional forces in Brčko. But I'm also aware of the possibility that this kind of movement could trigger a reaction from Russia, for example, and which may even include the deployment of Russian forces, paramilitary forces, establishment of the humanitarian center in Republika Srpska, which, according to my sources, have been discussed and even tentatively agreed already several years ago. The humanitarian center is similar to the one that exists in a niche in Serbia. So I think that, US and EU, they have different options and different tactics and strategies that they can and should apply. One option is to go harder and to reinforce EUFOR, to use sanctions, etc. Other option is to try to negotiate, as Kurt said, to maybe appease not only Dodik, but Čović and maybe Bosniaks as well. The problem that we see is that the US and EU are choosing either option, or let's say they have been negotiating, but they have not been negotiating from the position of serious power, serious effort. And they are certainly, at least for the time being, they are not using any stronger measures in the region. And to very quickly respond to your question, again, I think that regional and geopolitical context is very important, because pretty much all external powers, they have their own stakes in Bosnia and in the rest of the Balkans. They have their own interests. They have been playing games with the Balkans. They have been using the Bosnia and Herzegovina and rest of the Balkans as their chips in their geopolitical games. One could assume that in case of any further escalation of crisis, Turkey, as well as some of the Gulf countries, would support Bosniaks or Bosnian Muslims, not only financially, but potentially also with some troops, weapons, money, whatever. And this is the core of the problem as we see it. I mean, most experts, and I think that all of us panelists will agree, that Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also the rest of the Balkans today represents a major security risk for not only for the Balkans, but for all of the Europe. But we really don't see that this fact is being recognized, maybe a little bit more by Washington, but certainly not by the European capital.
Marko, why do you think Western powers have not taken more action, have not tried to use the leverage that they have? What is, do they feel that it's hopeless? Is the analysis that it won't work, or are they just spread too thin? Do they not care? What's going on?
Great question. Something I wonder myself. I think it's multiple factors. One is that this has slid way down the priority list. So it's not getting attention at all from people who are the top decision makers in any outside country. And it's not really getting anyone's undivided attention, which makes sense. I mean, it has been a long time. This is a small part of the world. It's relatively quiet-ish, compared to places that have an active shooting war. The other thing is there's not really a clear sense of what they want to do. So there is this sort of view that, well, when there's a lot of noise coming from Bosnia, we would like you to stop making noise. Okay, we would like you to, go back to what you were doing before that. And what you were doing before that was, participating in this long-running soap opera of a political crisis that occasionally turns kind of hot. It's not really a good situation. So, people keep saying, stop undermining Dayton, which is fine. Dayton is the Constitution. It's a peace agreement, so you should stop undermining it. But it's also something that is, I think, increasingly evidently not really capable of forming the basis for a sustainable society there. It's something that, continually generates problems, and nobody has really the appetite to get into the search for an alternative solution. That would be my main diagnosis there.
So for a lot of years, the notion was that eventually the EU would enlarge and everybody would join the EU and everything would be fine once everyone joined the EU. And in order to join the EU, people would calm down and start behaving themselves. Kurt, what's happened to this theory?
Well, it's still the operative policy that is still being pursued, despite, I would call, a decade and a half of demonstrated failure in Bosnia. And I would posit that it's not working well anywhere else in the Western Balkans either. But it's never been revisited. And so I think the biggest hurdle that we face toward reversing the current dynamic, or at least halting it and then beginning to reverse it, is not that it's impossible to do, and it's not just changed circumstances. So I take Stretcho's point that it's it, but if there has been geopolitical encroachment and relative diminution of leverage, again, that's on us. It's because we stuck with the old formula despite not being able to change it. I think that this rising to be a political problem rather than just a bureaucratic problem may help us finally turn it around. So long as people in the bureaucracies of the European Union primarily, but now clearly also the State Department, have been telling their bosses, we got this handled. We don't need to use those nasty executive tools. We've got our soft power. We have our the European perspective should be enough. Clearly that's failing. And the diplomatic effort to try to package this all up and repacify it also has hit the wall, as was mentioned just a moment ago. I think that's great because it was going in the wrong direction. So I'm glad there may be a chance for reassessment. But ultimately, the bottom line is, in Bosnia's case, you have a situation where the political elites that are empowered by Dayton, what you have right now is free range Dayton. This is Dayton without enforcement. This is rules-free Dayton. We stopped enforcing it in 2006. And so this is what it naturally defaults to. That is, these guys can keep what they stole, keep stealing, remain unaccountable politically and legally, because they've taken over the legal structures as well. Nothing the EU can offer them is better than that. So instead, you end up, the only lever you have, if you don't use hard power tools, you don't want to enforce, you don't want to admit you screwed up and be getting it wrong, all you could do is throw money and goodies at them. And validate them by meeting them and calling them president and so forth. That's how they're attempting to modulate the behavior, and it's not working. So that's why we are where we are.
Marco, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I mean there is also a problem with the fact that the main framework for dealing with Bosnia is exactly this EU enlargement framework that you laid out, Olya. And if you were to unpack it a little bit, the pitch from the EU is more or less, okay, Bosnians, you've got these really fundamental disagreements about what your country's going to be that you love arguing about and that mean a lot to you. And what we want you to do is to just not talk about that at all for the next 15 to 20 years, and instead work on these sort of really unpleasant, boring reforms that incidentally will also prevent you from doing the kind of corrupt self-dealing that Kurt alluded to just now. And then at the end of that, you're going to have rule of law, which means that you will probably go to jail, and then a few years after that, your country gets in the EU, unless we've lost interest by then, which we probably will. And for some reason, people are not really keen on that.
Srečko, do you want to jump in on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to say two things. I mean, one is that to underline that I do believe that responsibility for the crisis in Bosnia and Herzegovina lies primarily with the local actors, and is essentially directly linked with the collapse of the Washington Agreement and then Dayton Agreement, which resulted in the situation where the three main ethnic groups once again have opposing views on the past, present, and future of the country. But one thing that I wanted to add and to essentially briefly venture out of the Bosnia and Herzegovina specific issues is I want to stress that the crisis is present across the Balkans. But in each and every Balkan country, it is a different crisis, and all these crises have one thing in common, and that is the failure or even collapse of the European integration perspective. And as a result of this collapse, we are seeing today tensions and arms and weapons brought to the border between Serbia and Kosovo. We see ethnic and religious tensions and protests in Montenegro. At the conference that I attended a few days ago, one of the senior officials in North Macedonia said that unless Albania and North Macedonia do not get the start of the negotiations date in the next month or so, that the government in North Macedonia will definitely fail, that the North Macedonia will have to have elections in the next few months and will then follow the path of Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is, the crisis in Bosnia and Herzegovina seems to be and is probably the most difficult and the most obvious. But this failure in the transfer of responsibility from the US to the EU, which took place sometime after 2006, 2007 in the Balkans, is again creating a major risk for the entire continent.
So Srečko, I want to push on this a little bit. There's the integration model not really moving forward. Appetite for more hard power, also not much of that. If you can't force people to completely rethink their policies, what would you recommend they do, right? If, I find it difficult to imagine that unless something very terrible happens, something horrible happens, they're going to become suddenly enthusiastic about integration. It's like, oh my God, they've gone to war, let's immediately integrate them. They might become slightly more enthusiastic about sending more forces, but then again, they might not want to get dragged in. So what have they got? What else is in the toolkit?
Well, I believe that, and it's not really going back to where we were before, because in fact, I would dare to claim that the European Union, after taking over responsibility for the Balkans after 2006, 2007, never really established itself, especially not as a political actor. And it even, despite its obvious economic and financial resources, it never established itself as a strong economic power. I mean, yes, people would say that the statistics show that all of the Balkan countries, their main trade partners are different EU countries, but we are talking about different EU countries. I mean, people still do not see EU. People see Austria, people see trade with Germany or France or Italy, but people really don't see trade with the European Union. So to go back to your question, in my opinion, the trick for starters, stopping this very dangerous process is again going back to establishing strong carrots and sticks, something that US and EU, US 15 years ago, they had strong sticks. Strong carrots we missed from the EU. So I do hope that strong carrots and strong sticks could persuade local leaders, not only in Bosnia, but in the rest of the Balkans, to rethink their options. But on the other hand, as I said in one of my previous interventions, I'm also aware of the fact that today people like Dodik or Cholic are more influenced by Russia or Zagreb or Belgrade rather than by Brussels or Washington or Berlin. And that by itself carries a significant risk because it would require from both US and EU to work hand in glove, something they unfortunately haven't been doing a lot lately. And it requires from them to significantly up the ante, which they still seem to be reluctant to do.
Thank you. I want to start answering some of the questions that have come in. First of all, one from Alison Carragher of Carnegie Europe, who is asking when the Parliament of Republika Srpska first voted on Dodik's plan to withdraw from the National Pharmaceutical Institution, he only got 43 out of 80 votes, and that suggests that he is not the same as Republika Srpska, despite the kind of the narrative that we put forward. So who is the opposition? How does the diplomatic international community engage with that opposition? I don't know which of you would like to take a crack at that. Who volunteers? Marco volunteers.
So that's a good question. He improved his showing somewhat in the last round. I believe he got 49. So most of his coalition. The fact is that no one. I listened to that entire session in a just sort of mind-numbing one mind-numbing afternoon, and I don't recall a single Serb delegate to the assembly opposing him on the merits, saying, well, we don't think that we should be trying to take these powers that we've transferred to the Bosnian state level back. Of course, we all want to have them back. What we disagree with, Mr. Dodik, is how you're doing it. We think it's too rash. A few of them were actually saying we think it's not rash enough. And it struck me as them basically trying to make the best of this in political terms with an eye toward next year's elections, that they don't want to hand him a success that he can then ride into into a better showing in next October's polls. The other thing that's worth keeping in the back of the mind here is that everyone in Republika Srpska and everyone in BiH, for that matter, all the political actors, just assume that ultimately this is really all going to be decided somewhere else, somewhere out in the international community. And they're counting on that. And to some extent, the opposition is courting the international community by seeming to be more pro-Bosnian than they probably deep down really are. I mean, some of these opposition people, let's not forget, are from the party that, presided over the genocide of the early 90s. So it's a bit, I don't know, I guess it kind of gives you pause. But a good question.
Okay, thank you. And I think, Kurt, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, very briefly, and I answered some of it in the text there, but I mean,
she can't see that.
Okay, sorry. Well, but yeah, I mean, the RS is a pyramid, right? The Federation is a hydra, the RS is a pyramid. You have a vertical of power there, and while there's an RS opposition, and I would subscribe to a good bit of what Marco had said, the most important thing is that Dodik controls the coercive power of the RS, and we saw that coercive power applied in at the end of the Justice for David protests. And so there's genuine fear, which actually brought out people from the institutions at some risk to themselves to join those protests. So while there is some differentiation, there's not an alternative vision being propounded from the RS opposition, or really from any quarter in Bosnia and Herzegovina, to other than trying to further optimize the system to suit their political agendas, and usually political ethnic agendas. So I do think that there's there needs to be engagement with the opposition, but I think we need to leapfrog a lot of the political actors and really first try to create a more stable environment for people to feel secure. Not just from a safe and secure environment should not simply mean against a resumption of armed conflict, but it also should be read to mean, and can be read to mean, prevention of application of coercive power against peaceful demonstrators. And a lot of people are afraid of their own power, the police in their own canton or entity. That would allow movement and actual get a reading of the situation of what people actually want, rather than what the Dodiks, Čovićs, Izetbegovićs et al. Want, which I think we already have a pretty clear idea.
Okay. Thanks, Kurt. I've got a question from our good friend, anonymous attendee, who asks how any of the three of you, I suppose, see the role of Vučić regarding the rhetoric of Dodik and his secessionist tendencies. Strečko, go ahead.
It's a great question, and if we would ask that question to 5 different local or international officials and experts, we would probably get 6 different answers, and probably all these answers would be at least partially true and partially wrong. The fact is that the relationship between Vučić and Dodik is different from those that Vučić had, the Dodik with Tadić before Vučić. And on the other hand, Vučić is clearly playing quite elaborate chess game with both regional and global actors. So sometimes he's supporting Dodik, sometimes he's opposing Dodik, sometimes he's doing one thing publicly but the opposing thing privately, and vice versa. But what I'm seeing recently is that Vučić has been coming under increased pressure from both Americans and Germans, and especially in regard to the problems that have been caused by Dodik, as well as some of the criminal developments in Serbia. Vučić, regarding the latest Dodik initiative, the withdrawal from the state institutions that Dodik initiated in July, and then the launch of this initiative for the so-called return to the original Dayton, which Dodik launched in October, Vučić was relatively silent on it. So he avoided to directly declare himself. The problem being is that there is ample evidence to suggest that Dodik has received green light from Russia on this latest initiative. And as long as Russia is supporting Dodik, he really doesn't need support from Vučić, or he can even go against his objections, which was, for example, the case in 2016 when Dodik held this referendum on the day of Republika Srpska, despite the fact that a major part of the international community, as well as Vučić, openly criticized him for that, and Vučić publicly told him not to do it.
Thank you. I actually want to invite everybody to ask more questions, and I think they're coming in, but before I read them, I want to follow up on this a little bit and ask Marco and Kurt to weigh in a little bit on how they see the Russian and Turkish engagement, involvement, and actually interests in all of this. Kurt, do you want to go first? You seem
I'm happy to, sure. Didn't mean to jump ahead of Marco. I mean, look, I think Dodik is Russia's most valuable player in the region, and that relationship is tighter. Vučić is doing this arbitrage. You know, he's juggling the Russians, the Americans, the Chinese, the Europeans, the Turks, the Gulfies, and doing that very well. I think Russia wants to both obstruct further enlargement, both of NATO and the European and generally give the West a hard time and humiliate the West in a region where it has been dominant for a very long time. China is interested. What's very interesting is that we first saw this in the Security Council last summer, when China aligned itself with Russia in objecting to the appointment of Christian Schmidt as International High Representative in Bosnia. And then we saw it again with the U4 mandate debate last month. So China is becoming far more assertive diplomatically worldwide, but you see that in the Balkans as well, and they have more economic. They plug into the mainframe of whatever the power structure is in a given country, use the paper key, and then they get leverage. Turks do much the same. So I think the real story, while geopolitical contestation does change the dynamic, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, this is a place, again, where structurally, as a result of the Dayton Peace Agreement and the relative correlation of forces, the biggest vacuum is our own will to accept what's gone on, accept the fact that we've been getting it wrong, and design our policies appropriately and our posture appropriately. That doesn't mean that the Russians couldn't still make trouble, but I think we could radically reduce their leverage. It's a first mover advantage question. Right now, it's a vacuum. It's a void. And so I think that what's happened, unfortunately, I'll leave it at this, and it's in the dynamic that I sort of explained in the chat. There's some graphics. Effectively, the EU and the US are behaving in the same way towards elites in Bosnia and region-wide as the illiberal actors are. We're validating them. We're trying to co-opt them. And effectively, from a citizen perspective, it looks like we're on the political leaders' side against them as citizens. And that's a dynamic that is real self-inflicted wound. And it impedes the development of functioning democracy in Bosnia and Herzegovina and region-wide. But it also, it puts the lie to this idea that we're on the side of freedom and democracy versus authoritarianism, because we're effectively investing in the distressed assets of the bad guys because it's the easiest thing to do, and we can cover our tracks of a failure that got us to where we are.
Well, we're the ones, I mean, we, right, collective West, not sure I can take responsibility for it, are the ones who put these people into positions of power. I mean, it also occurs to me, and I want to turn to Marco with this, that NATO and the EU are, at least when it comes to Bosnia, are in violent agreement with the Russians about no NATO or EU enlargement to these places, right? Or to this specific place. There's, this is not Russia being a spoiler. This is Russia wanting desperately something that's happening anyway. So Marco, what's your take on all of these geostrategic engagements?
Well, I think if I had to guess about what the Russians were doing, because they're not, really very transparent about this. This is not an area that is, anywhere near their primary concern. Okay, main concerns, for Russia are much more Ukraine and other areas close to the border. This is, however, an area where they can do things at very low cost and low risk, and an area that matters a lot more to people they care about, namely the United States and the European Union, than it does to them. So, let's not forget, this was one of the two big Clinton administration foreign policy successes, ending the war here, the other one being the intervention in Kosovo and the independence of Kosovo, where Russia is, coincidentally also in a position to cause some problems, right? So it may be that they intend at some point to offer, and this again is total speculation, it may be that they will offer to cooperate in the Western Balkans in exchange for some concessions in some place like Ukraine. I have no idea how that would go over, probably not very well, but, if this whole area were to drop off the face of the earth, nobody in Moscow, I think, would really, lose a night of sleep.
Yeah, but I think the problem is nobody in the West would either. So offering to trade the Balkans for Ukraine, which everybody does care about, is not going to solve anybody's problem, I suspect. So I'm going to, Tail Kendall has written in to say, and actually kind of echoing some of the thinking I've had, it seems to me you're implying the opposition in many ways is no better than Dodik, that they're not opposed to secession, that they're in essence waiting to be saved from outside, that this offers no they take no responsibility for what is happening. And is there no one else who are willing to work for the good of the country? And by that, I take this to mean within the country rather than waiting to be saved, who understand they themselves must take responsibility for the developments, and whom the international community should support. So, instead of the white knights of NATO and the EU riding to the rescue, who within this country, other than this kind of amorphous people that we're supposed to be supporting, is there to, in fact, empower? So, Kurt, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I think it's important, and I think that the crisis that we're seeing, and especially the push on the election law and constitutional reform that the U.S. and EU worked hand in glove to really try to ramrod through, brought out a lot of opposition, including by the plaintiffs of the European Court of Human Rights rulings, in whose name this was being pursued, including Azra Zornic being among the most vocal about that. She was the plaintiff who basically brought the case saying, I don't want to call myself Bosniak-Croat or Serb, and I still want to run for president, and she won. So there's not yet critical mass of a real alternative that can have traction statewide among citizens. I think there's a potential constituency there. I think there are potential leaders who have emerged. Unfortunately, we've created a very non-conducive environment for people to stick their necks out. But because I think also people have seen, though, that nobody's on their side effectively. If you're frustrated with the system, if you're disgusted with the powers that be, and yet you see the international community, which means basically the West in the connotation in Bosnia, treating with these guys trying to cut a deal to just calm things down, and so they could work on other stuff, understandably, but not, it's a betrayal of principle. You're gonna either want to leave the country or tune out. But a lot of people are very frustrated, and they're like, okay, we've got to take this into our hands because no external actor has our best interests in mind. Not the EU, not the United States, not the Russians, not the Chinese, not the Turks, not the Arabs, nobody. So I think there's potential there. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but one of the people who spoke at the RSNA session, Mirko Šarović, who was quite clear that this is, if we do this, we're moving in the direction of war, and he used that term. He was the most statesman-like minister in the Bosnian government for 2 governments running, which is surreal because he was moved from office earlier by the High Representative for anti-Dayton activity. So I think with different incentives, you might have some people behave differently, probably not the apex predators of this system, but people below that.
I mean, I have to say, kind of this notion that it's the job of the West to save the people from their governments in the Balkans or anywhere else. I'm not 100% certain that the populations of Western countries feel that that's their job, or that the governments of Western countries feel that that's their job, that, this kind of notion that it is the people themselves need to save themselves. Srčko, you want to jump in?
Yes, and you're absolutely right, and I share your frustration as the resident of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I share your frustration with a situation where my country depends again on the decisions that will be made elsewhere. But the thing is that Bosnia and Herzegovina, or even the entire Balkans, has been created by the US and EU interventions. So there is implied responsibility there. That's number one. And even more importantly, I think that, or let me put it this way, I hope that EU and US decision makers will not be observing this issue and this question from the point of view of their moral obligations, which in modern world are or can produce dubious results. But I would like that they observe this quagmire and their potential response to it from the point of view of their own internal security, because I think that we all agree here that if the situation in Bosnia or in the rest of the Balkans continues escalating, it will again represent a major security risk for all of the Europe, as it did in the 90s. And I would also like to very quickly jump in and give my 5 cents on the previous question, and would actually take it even further. I think that both Kurt and Marco were too diplomatic and too nice. I mean, the problem that we are facing in Bosnia and Herzegovina is that very often opposition parties are worse than the ruling ones in different ways. Milorad Dodik, who is now kind of embodiment of almost all the problems that Bosnia and Herzegovina is facing, but of course is not the only one. He is actually very often respected not only by Bosnian Serbs, but also by Bosniaks and Bosnian Croats for the courage and steadfastness that he is showing in his politics. He doesn't care. And people, unfortunately, in the modern world tend to like that. What we are seeing with most opposition parties is that they are playing games, and they are at the same time trying to portray themselves as better option than the ruling parties, but are very often taking the same populist and nationalist and radical positions and views, trying to essentially do the same thing that the ruling parties are doing. And their main motive is very often, again, I'm not trying to equalize all local politicians, but very often local parties show that they want to take over power, not to be responsible managers and governors, but to essentially do what the ruling parties are doing, to share the spoils, to distribute the positions, etc., etc.
Thank you. Marco, you had your hand up for a moment, but you took it down. Was it because you didn't want to jump in anymore, or?
I just, yeah, I figured you'd see it and call on me. I didn't want to have a little symbol up there. Something super important about that question. I'm sorry, I forget the name of the person who asked it. It was about the opposition, and the point that, isn't there anyone who's willing to fight for the country, to do what's right for the country? They all think that that's exactly what they're doing, all of them. And this is, if I could get one point across tonight, and you forget everything else that I said, it would be that they all, sure, they're all corrupt, absolutely, but they all also think that what they're pushing for is the right thing, and people keep voting for them on that basis, right? Because that's what they come out with in the election campaign. So, it's not like they're thinking we just want, sink Bosnia for its own sake because we're evil people. They really think that it will be better certainly for their constituency if there's less Bosnia, and we're talking about the RS now, or no Bosnia. That's the way forward. And the thing that makes this so tragically hard to deal with is the country is just split almost exactly 50-50 between these two incompatible visions: more stronger central government versus weaker central government. That's a problem.
So we are running low on time. What I'm going to therefore do is read out the 3 questions we have in the queue, and then go back to all 3 of you, first Strechko, then Kurt, then Marco, to respond to these questions and offer any concluding thoughts that you would like to offer. So the 3 questions, all from variations on the theme of anonymous attendee. I don't know if it's all the same person, 3 different people, or some combination thereof. First, do you see any connection between the secessionist tendencies of Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the creation of the Association of Serb majority municipalities in the north of Kosovo? So that's question one. Question two, considering the geographical distance of Russia, secession by Republika Srpska can hardly be successful without external support from Serbia. Do you think that secession is a real and concrete goal for Dodik, and will he really try to push it to the end? Third question, how do you see the regional initiative started recently, Open Balkans, supported till now only by Serbia, Albania, and Northern Macedonia? Do you see any contradiction with the Berlin process? And we've now got a fourth one, which I'll also pose. 2 years ago, some plans were discussed about a land swap between Serbia and Kosovo. These plans were rejected by former German Chancellor Merkel. Do you think they could be reactivated? So I'm going to close the questions now. I'm going to turn first to Srećko to respond to as many of these as you want and for any closing thoughts.
Well, I'll try to be quick. Regarding well, don't close them because now I don't see them. Anyway,
you can see them if you click on answered. You can still see them. Sorry, if you click on answered, you can still see the questions.
So let me address the most important one, and that is the link between Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and there are let's say two layers of the links. One layer is that Kosovo is using the argument of Bosnia and Herzegovina for not wanting to establish the association of the Serb communities, because they are saying they do not want to copy-paste the failed approach that the international community took in Bosnia and have similar or same results in Kosovo. Additional problem or additional layer is the notion of so-called Serb world, which has been in circulation over the last couple of years as some kind of replacement for the calls for Greater Serbia, Greater Albania, Greater Bosnia, and Greater Croatia from 19th. And in essence, it has to do with the idea of the land swap, and it comes down to the point where some officials in Serbia and in Republika Srpska, they believe that if Serbia is to restore or to regulate its relationship with Kosovo, it needs to get something in exchange. The original deal that was offered to Serbia and to Kosovo was a membership or something close to the membership. Membership in the European Union is clearly not on the table. And again, as we've been discussing, this is a major problem. And in the absence of the EU membership, some Serbian officials and some Bosnian Serb officials are saying, well, if you're not giving Serbia membership, then at least they should get Republika Srpska. And then I will close with this last question about the real possibility of secession. I do think that if Dodik is allowed to continue without very firm, not strong, but concrete and relevant reaction from the US and the EU, I am quite convinced that Dodik will continue pushing this envelope until he eventually has the situation which is either legal or territorial disintegration of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which cannot happen without new conflict.
Thank you. Kurt.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick up on that point. I mean, on the land swap, border correction, whatever euphemism, partition pitch that was made. I don't think, I mean, you've got a different government in Kosovo now, which largely came back to power because of the United States helping depose his government, Albin Kurti's government previously. I don't think that could be resurrected easily. And the new German government's no more for it than the previous one was. And I think a lot of other member states were behind Germany, or at least sympathetic with its objection. On Open Balkans, Certainly, from what I understand, the people behind the Berlin process see it as contradictory, while the Americans are pitching it as more is better. And it's very weird how the United States has gotten behind this from out of nowhere. It's become the main policy point. And usually, when you hear economics being touted, it means that the political process has failed, and so we'll shift gears to throw money at it, and everything will be cool. So the point is that a lot of EU members see it as contradictory, and it's mainly an ego vehicle for Vučić and Rama. On whether Dodik wants to pursue it, I agree with Srećko, and I want to add one thing. I mean, if we're always playing this intent game, and usually the subtext to questioning intent, which you have to do, is how little can we get away with dealing with this? How can we ignore his threats? And ignoring this has gotten us to this point. Had there been a credible deterrent, we wouldn't be here. Had there not been appeasement on the legal structure, with the structured dialogue on the judiciary, et cetera, we wouldn't be here now. So I think he will push it if doesn't have resistance, and that will mean violence one way or another. And on the association, certainly Kosovars see them as linked. And so you do have this rope-a-dope of what are we going to get? We need to be compensated. And there had the damage of discussing the land swap was it opened the door to territorial changes. One of the reasons that you have Vučić and Rama so buddy is Vučić, and if you listen to his language, he's very clear. He talks about we need an accommodation among Serbs and Albanians, which implies that the borders are flexible. It's among peoples, and this is something that goes back to the 1980s, and it's very dangerous. So I think that is a subtext under which certainly they think they're going to fly under open Balkans, and it now has an American imprimatur, which is problematic, I would posit.
All right, Marco, final responses and thoughts.
Yeah, I'm glad we're actually wrapping up with this comparison in some ways. We're looking at the links between Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina, two countries that really don't understand each other well at all, given that they were part of the same, Yugoslavia and are very close. The Association of Serb Municipalities is totally unlike Republika Srpska, and the intensity, and it is very intense, of the Kosovar opposition to the association is testimony to how little genuine understanding there is of things in BIH. The problem that Bosnia has with Republika Srpska is that it has an effective chokehold on decision making at the central level. It is not that it is an autonomous entity. I mean, people in Sarajevo don't care that RS gets to decide what's taught in the schools and whatnot. They care that they can veto everything, and there's nothing in the association, of that nature. And there is an odd sort of similarity, in fact, between the vision of governance of the current Kosovo government of Albin Kurti's Vetëvendosje movement and that of Dodik, including in very literal ways the criticism that Kurti's government recently gave of a constitutional court, Kosovo constitutional court decision having to do with the Serb Orthodox Church, which was basically, yeah, we're not going to pay attention to that because the court got the law wrong, is exactly the same as what Dodik is saying about the Bosnian constitutional court. Yeah, theoretically we're supposed to listen to it, but we disagree, so we're not going to. And I think now to get it back to Bosnia, and this is my last comment, what I think he is saying, who knows what he really means, but what Dodik is saying is the vision of Bosnia and Herzegovina that we see our fellow Bosnian citizens in Sarajevo and the international community the vision that you're working on, we reject that. Okay, if that's what you want, we're leaving. And, you know, at that point, we can maybe renegotiate. But if you don't want to renegotiate, we're going to try and leave. That, I think, is the message, and I think it's entirely serious. And I think it is something that that is also, yeah, it opens up a lot of risks for people there and for the region as well.
Thank you, Marco. We have a comment in the chat. We are out of time. I'll read the comment because YouTube viewers, I think, don't have access to these chats. It's from Jasmina Mersho, who writes, regardless of what was said about the opposition in Republika Srpska, I would have liked if Srećko could elaborate a bit more on the ways the opposition parties in all of Bosnia and Herzegovina are worse than the ruling parties, because this sends a very dark message of no alternatives, while at the same time it's continuously emphasized how the West is strengthening the ruling parties with their current approach. Keeping in mind some of the meetings held between opposition parties from Republika Srpska and some parts of the FBIH, I would kindly disagree that the alternative would be worse than the current situation. And Jasmina is from the European Network of Political Foundations. You know, I think we could go on this and on other topics and on agency and on responsibility and on what's worse and for whom for a very long time. Perhaps we should get back together to have the broader conversation. I think I would enjoy that. In the meantime, I would like to ask all of you to join me in thanking our panelists and thanking one another, thanking our audience for the participation and engagement, and also thanking the European Union for their support of this discussion, which again, I do hope is one of many more to come. But thank you all for joining us and for really a very rich, if not optimistic, discussion.